This program concerns the building blocks of development, our human and natural resources, and their interactions in the island setting. The focus is a regional workshop held on St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands, and attended by planners, environmentalists, and development specialists. They discussed ways of working together to improve use of the island's resources for long-term development. The main mechanism discussed was the Biosphere Reserve, part of the International Man and the Biosphere program. Since the first settlements in the Eastern Caribbean, man learned to use the resources of his island environment to further the development of his community. All settlers of the islands, be they Amerindian, European, African, or East Indian, brought with them skills and techniques based on the accumulated knowledge of their elders on large continental areas with sparse populations. Much of this knowledge had to be adapted to the special challenges of the island environment. Adaptation led to new customs in fishing, farming, and trading. In time, these new methods became traditional and remained viable as long as populations and technologies remained stable. As development efforts intensify, the rate of change increases, and with it, uncertainty. The effects of development become apparent only after several years. Apparently unrelated resources are in fact found to be related. Development of one resource may have negative effects on others. It is only after these effects are felt that we are able to determine who benefits and who loses and in what ways. To understand the full effects of these and other specific kinds of development, we need to monitor and document development. With this knowledge available, decision makers will be better able to predict the effects of their decisions. Each island has had different experiences and can contribute to better understanding of these problems. Cooperation among the islands has been slow at the official level. New mechanisms are needed to effectively share experiences among islands and use these for training and education. The Biosphere Reserve is one such mechanism. It is one element of UNESCO's Man and the Biosphere program. The Biosphere Reserve is an internationally recognized managed area designated by individual countries. Its purpose is to provide a focal point and living laboratory for learning better ways to use our human and natural resources for development on a sustainable basis through research, demonstration, and training. The meeting on St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands was called on the occasion of the dedication of the Virgin Islands National Park as a Biosphere Reserve. It is presently the only one in the Lesser Antilles and will serve for learning and demonstration that will be of benefit to the region. In the future, other islands may become interested in declaring their own biosphere reserves as focal points for cooperation. The meeting participants were welcomed to the U.S. Virgin Islands by Mr. Carmelo Morales of the Lieutenant Governor's Office.
I am extremely gratified that St. John, the smallest gem of the Virgin Islands, was chosen as the site for these deliberations on biosphere reserves. It is on this note that I take great pleasure on behalf of Governor Juan Luis and Lieutenant Governor Julio Brady in extending welcome to St. John to all of you.
Franklin Margetson, President of the Caribbean Conservation Association, opened the discussion by noting,
I will be truthful and admit that I am no expert on conservation, no expert on integrated development, and certainly no expert on Eastern Caribbean affairs. But before somebody says, sit down, man, I will add that I am a layman with a blind faith in the role and relevance of conservation during this phase of our development. An era that sees a sort of courtship taking place between the aggressive development patterns of the 20th and 21st centuries and these delicate, fragile islands in the Eastern Caribbean sun.
To get a better idea of the real problems of the Eastern Caribbean as perceived by the participants from the various islands, They were asked to prepare a summary of the present status and problems associated with natural resources in the Eastern Caribbean. Bisasar Chakalal, projects officer of the Caribbean Conservation Association, went over these written summaries and concluded.
Also, all the countries emphasize their dependence on natural resources and that their survival depends on the management or the sustainable management of these resources.
He went on to summarize the characteristics of the natural resources of the region as reflected in the country reports.
The resources of the islands are very diverse indeed at the regional level as well as at the island level. Also, they are limited in availability, and we all know of their fragility. In terms of population, it is also, as Alan said, most dense populated area in the Western Hemisphere, and it's very diverse as well. In terms of economic activities, it's based mainly on agriculture, tourism. Some islands do not have, they're based on agriculture. They place it more on tourism, like the United States Virgin Islands, the Netherlands Antilles. But all the islands are placing emphasis on tourism development. Industry, most of the industries are small, export-oriented, light industries, with probably the exception of Curacao and St. Croix, where we have large oil refineries.
Yves Reynard of the Eastern Caribbean Natural Area Management Program and based in St. Lucia went on to summarize the problems associated with resource management in the islands.
The major problem that comes out from those reports, and which is well stated by the St. Lucia report, says that the fundamental problem relates to resolving the conflicting demands of various users of limited and fragile resources. And all the problems we see fall within that larger framework. On the top of the list, on most of the reports, is a problem related to land and to the loss of agricultural land to urbanization, industry, and tourism. And related to that is a problem of land erosion, soil erosion. Deforestation and the problem of watershed management comes also on the top of the list very often as a major problem. And related to that, more specific to the Netherlands, is the problem of groundwater management. Also, very often as one of the three top problems is the question of the degradation of natural scenic features, especially as considered as resources for tourism development. And this is considered as a major problem. And more generally, and it's especially very clearly stated for Guadeloupe and Martinique, but we found that in most of the reports, is the question of the impact, the negative impacts of tourism development. And again, more specifically, the problems of coastal zone management, which are derived from that.
With a clearer view of the problems shared among the islands, the focus of the meeting shifted to the role and functions of biosphere reserves. Dr. Bernd von Drost of UNESCO introduced the concept in this way.
That the concept of biosphere reserve has been one of the major innovations of natural resources management in recent decades. Its bold goal is to promote a balanced relationship between people and the environment, and is a challenge to existing management approaches and institutions. The basic idea behind the biosphere reserve concept is also the idea of networking, that biosphere reserves should form an international network. And we have a number of networks, and it is perhaps particularly appropriate to mention an idea which I find particularly challenging, which would be to develop cooperation between small island biosphere reserves within comparable ecological zones.
Dr. William Gregg, co-chairman of the U.S. Man and the Biosphere Project Directorate on Biosphere Reserves, underlined the requirements for success.
The success of a biosphere reserve depends on the involvement of large numbers of people, working together in a spirit of service to make each reserve a regional center for the study of natural and managed landscapes, for demonstrating improved resource management techniques which are sensitive to the capabilities, social organization, and cultural traditions of a particular region, and for building a conservation ethic by furnishing education, practical training, and basic material resources to improve the well-being of the people on whose shoulders the protection of the reserve and the conservation of the region ultimately depend. A successful Biosphere Reserve thus is a magnet for drawing the best-informed scientists and resource managers together from within and outside the region to develop the scientific basis for intelligent management of natural resources to meet a full range of human needs, both material and spiritual.
But what is new about the concept of biosphere reserves, and how do they differ from other protected areas such as national parks? Dr. Craig McFarland of the Tropical Agricultural Research and Training Center in Costa Rica provided this analysis.
First of all, the emphasis is on balanced relationship between people and resources, in other words, human needs and management of the environment. It provides a managerial and an institutional framework for dealing with that relationship. At least it theoretically provides that. Thirdly, it allows bridging of traditional barriers. In other words, barriers between institutions and barriers between disciplines, even barriers between different sectors of society or the public. Fourthly, it provides a linkage of protected areas to the surrounding communities and land and waters where the resources are. It's an outward-looking thing from the protected areas outward. Fifth, it provides opportunities for study and demonstration of viable options for resource, land or water resources use. In other words, fisheries, forestry, all sorts of uses. It provides opportunities for monitoring of trends and impacts of development and management. What happens when you develop and when you manage? You can monitor it in appropriately set up Biosphere Reserve, both of those things. Extension, it offers opportunities for guidelines and alternatives for change. In other words, changes in attitudes which then result in actual changes in the way people practice their resource use. Education and training of managers, of scientists, of the public in general, all sectors, all levels. And last of all, because of these core zones that they have, at the same time that it does all these other things, it should offer the opportunity for protection of key ecological processes and genetic resources. So that's why it's innovative. Supposedly you can do all those things in a biosphere reserve if it's designed in the right way. Now let's take a look at reality.
But Dr. McFarland was also quick to point out that in many areas of the world, the Biosphere Reserve has not lived up to its promise.
The fact of the matter is, with some very few exceptions here and there, and despite the fact that there are well over 200 of these in over 60 countries, in fact, in terms of implementation or practice, the impact has been low, and implementation is lagging very far behind the establishment of reserves.
Dr. McFarland pointed out some of the reasons for this.
The point is that most resource managers, in fact, most managers who are heads of places that have been called or nominated and accepted as biosphere reserves, with some exceptions, really see it as an international label of importance or recognition, but not as a new management approach or a new management concept.
He further pointed out that
Biosphere reserves typically require multi-institutional or organizational collaboration. That creates problems. You get a lot of friction and a lot of delay in implementation, just because it requires more than one institution or organization, be it private or public, to manage the area.
given the promise and problems associated with biosphere reserves, the delegates at the meeting raised a number of important issues for discussion. Many questioned whether biosphere reserves are a practical and effective way for addressing development concerns in the Eastern Caribbean. Ivor Jackson of the Eastern Caribbean Natural Area Management Program, based in Antigua, voiced his concerns.
As you know, most of the islands in the Eastern Caribbean, this is the area that we deal with mostly, depend very much on the natural resources for development, and mainly for the sectors of tourism, agriculture, and fisheries. Now, in order for development to be sustained for any length of time, I think there's a real need for us to understand the resources that contribute to the development of the islands, and to manage those resources so that they can contribute to further development, which, of course, will influence social and economic benefits that accrue to people of these islands.
During the discussion, Mr. Jackson linked his concerns about natural resources and development to the establishment of biosphere reserves.
I think in terms of the economic and social needs of the Caribbean, that there's an urgency to determine what management regimes can help to reach the objectives. Now, I think it is possible to establish a multi-island biosphere reserve within the Caribbean without having that making a significant contribution to meeting or resolving the problems that we're facing.
Mervyn Williams from the Planning Office in St. Lucia picked up on Mr. Jackson's concern.
To come back to Ivor's point, the question of the national needs as perceived in the individual island. I think there's a couple of things that we might tend to overlook. One is the scale of the islands and the fact that there are very few of the natural resources in these islands that remain in a relatively untouched situation. The resources are all under utilization, and in planning for the future of these islands, in the context of expanded populations, in the context of the present urgency to get economic development going, to put in infrastructural works and so forth, you have a situation where it is the areas that present themselves as likely candidates for the creation of biosphere reserves or protected areas. In a sense, in most islands, sort of the last frontier, they're the areas that are now being looked at for utilization for some purpose or the other. And even in attempting to resolve one particular environmental problem, I found in our situation in St. Lucia, you tend to be often in the situation of creating an environmental problem of dimensions which you're not quite sure of. What do you do? So that in adopting the approaches towards biosphere reserves, I think one has always got to bear in mind that despite the similarity of the islands, when we resolve this in terms of the particular island itself, its needs and the issues to which that island will respond to in terms of a biosphere reserve are unique, are very unique. And the process has got to be one that probably is a parallel process that looks on the one hand at the economic and social issues of the particular island, and on the other hand, the broader biogeographical, ecological issues, and attempt at all stages in that process to interlink the two types of issues.
Other delegates voiced opinions on the usefulness of the Biosphere Reserve from the perspective of their own institutions or islands, and a variety of opinions surfaced. In an interview with Franklin Margetson of the Caribbean Conservation Association, Victor Williams from the St. Kitts Nevis Planning Office offered this view.
But my opinion is that to have a strict biosphere reserve would probably not go over too well with us. In a state that has very limited land, when one has to consider the possibility of, for want of a better word, tying up land as a biosphere reserve, one has to ask the question, can we afford to do that? We, the technocrats, would recognize the significance of having areas set aside for scientific research, etc. But in my opinion, a more practical approach would be to have what we could call a multi-functioning area, an area where you could have manipulative use. It would to some extent satisfy the scientific research wing of it, and it would also satisfy the developmental needs of the country. However, this approach, we must recognize that effective management methods must be employed. So
another view was presented by Dr. Walter Backhouse of the Caribbean Marine Biology Institute in Curacao during an interview with Mr. Chakalal of the Caribbean Conservation Association.
Nature. I think a biosphere is indeed more than only conservation of nature. It also implies making use of natural resources in a broader sense, making use of what is needed for the people, etc. So I think it is a good endeavor. Practice must show how it fits into the island systems, but personally I think it will be something worthwhile to track.
Brian Hudson, at the time of the meeting, the Director of Planning in Grenada, thought it would apply very well in the case of Grenada.
But what we're looking at, in fact, is our models for eco-development, which really ought to apply on a larger scale. In order for us to develop our economies in a way that is sustainable, we have to learn from systems such as this. So I think that this is an appropriate approach. It is something far more than the mere preservation. It is a way of looking at the wise use of the resources we have.
The sum of these statements seems to indicate a rather broad base of support among technicians for the establishment of a system of